You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 7th of October, 2024, on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme, in an age of spiralling conflicts and a year of crucial elections, the job of analysing geopolitical risks is getting harder and harder. We'll speak with the analyst Tina Fordham about why she's confident the world has not yet reached a tipping point. After that,
so there were many questions being asked in those first hours, but there was a collective acknowledgement that this was a major moment.
On the one-year anniversary of Hamas's attack on Israel, we speak with the editor-in-chief of The National in Abu Dhabi to get the view from the Middle East. We'll also get a roundup of news from the Nordics, and finally,
when I describe our businesses, I say that we've done the heavy lifting for you. We've gone out, we've looked at every brand, we've been in every showroom, we've done everything, and we have selected the things that we deem to be really the most relevant for our customer and the best that's out there.
Monocle's fashion director Natalie Theodosi in conversation with Yoox Net-a-Porter's interim CEO Alison Loehnis. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Now, if you are keeping an eye on the news these days, it would be hard not to be overwhelmed by the conflicts and geopolitical spats taking over narratives across the globe. That coupled with 2024 being the biggest ever global election year. We're going to unpack them all, or at least some of them, into one segment today because we're joined by Tina Fordham, founder of Fordham Global Foresight and an analyst of geopolitical risk. And Tina, there are a lot of geopolitical risks at the moment. The word inflection point is something that has been thrown around a lot for this year, for the year of 2024, even before it started. Does it still ring true to you?
Yes, well, I called my 2024 outlook inflection point, but at the time I said, well, it could be worse. I could be calling it tipping point. And I think, therefore, it is still fair to say, with a small amount of optimism, that we may avoid the worst outcome of the world being at a tipping point and, going over into the abyss. But the idea that the elections this year, especially, obviously, the U.S. elections and the hot wars that are taking place between Russia and Ukraine and in the Middle East, as well as other conflicts, are really weighing on the economic outlook, the financial outlook, as well as on global institutions, and the humanitarian situation is impossible to get away from. There is a lot happening at once, and it's really straining the seams of the global system.
Well, and we will get to some of those, but just to follow up on that, first of all, perhaps unpack a little more for us why you feel we are still at the inflection point. I mean, I think many people listening to the news today might feel we have reached that tipping point. Where is the optimism that we're not at the abyss just yet?
Well, in my discipline, I am a political scientist by training. We tend to think about global developments in terms of institutions, the rule of law, central banks, the courts, even the media, etc. These are the building blocks that help keep the ecosystem that we live in place and prevent things from getting worse. The strength of institutions, even softer factors like trust that people have between each other and between themselves, government, neighbors, etc., are what keep things stable and allow us to manage these periods of more confrontation and more conflict. And so the source of optimism is that our institutions manage to hold up and withstand these pressures. As someone who's originally from the US, now based in Europe for the last 23 years, I look at the US elections almost the way I did when I started my career in finance as an emerging markets analyst, where we're looking at whether these institutions will survive and be able to mitigate the risks.
So the institutions are just about still holding, in other words. And as you did bring up the U.S. elections, that is one that we wanted to focus on first of all, because they are under 30 days away now. And that is one where there's a question for some people of, whether the institution will hold or not. How do you look at the sort of scenarios and the possible outcomes? How will they matter for the globe?
Well, as we head into this race, even though there have been so many extraordinary twists and turns, from Biden leaving the race to the Trump assassination attempt and Kamala Harris rising to the top of the ticket, what's really extraordinary, even compared to other elections, is how stable the polls are. 1 point in either direction could actually translate into a pretty sizable victory in the Electoral College for the winner. So the first thing is, all bets are off. You're not seeing very many pollsters make forecasts, and that points to how high the stakes are. This is the fifth U.S. election that I've covered professionally, and if we think back to other times when there has been that disconnect between the Electoral College and the popular vote, in 2016 between Hillary Clinton and Trump, or 2000 Bush-Gore, what needs to happen if we get an election outcome that's referred to the Supreme Court is for people to accept that outcome. Now, in 2000, Al Gore wasn't very happy about the Supreme Court decision, but he accepted it. And so a question we have to ask now, given that U.S. public support, belief in the Supreme Court has dropped to about 20%, is whether that would happen again. And that's going to be the test of the institutions, as well as, quite simply, just the machinery of the vote counting.
And then, speaking of some contradictory messaging, I suppose, that you have to unpack, when it comes to the Middle East conflict at the moment, we are at the 1 year mark since the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. One of the things that's been interesting about this is that perhaps it hasn't had such a huge economic impact on the world, but you have recently seen oil prices starting to rise in response to the conflict. Where is that coming from? And do you get a sense then that we are now seeing maybe wider implications of this conflict?
Well, the concern has been all along about whether the confrontation, the conflict between Israel and Hamas, would remain contained to Gaza, where there isn't energy infrastructure, or whether the conflict would escalate, especially to the point where it might involve state-to-state conflict between Israel and Iran. In the past, before U.S. shale gas and energy independence, a conflict of these proportions would have moved oil prices. That hasn't been the case. Oil has been rather low at around $72 a barrel, going up to $75 last week. But again, with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and in the Middle East, those are two parts of the world where you could see an impact on growth and on asset prices. And that's what makes these conflicts more impactful for markets in the global economy than places like Sudan, for example, Afghanistan, etc. So we're really in a precarious situation with that in mind. But I suspect markets will continue to be complacent, even as we have these massive bombing attacks going on by Israel in Lebanon, unless or until Iran responds. And that's the shoe that we're waiting to drop right now. How will Israel rather respond to Iran's firing of 200 ballistic missiles last week? When oil prices moved a few days ago, it was following comments from President Biden saying that they were looking with Israel at attacking Iran's energy infrastructure. So that's what accounted for that action.
And just finally, Tina, I mean, you mentioned there perhaps some of this complacency in the markets. I wonder if there is something else that you are keeping an eye on as a geopolitical strategist. You mentioned a number of conflicts there and through this conversation. Is there something else that perhaps the markets are not watching that you are advising your clients about?
What I have found interesting during the course of the 25 years that I've been doing this is how differently business leaders in different parts of the world view events. There's still a lot more optimism in Asia and indeed in the United States and the Middle East than there is here in Europe. We are very much exposed and in the crosshairs. We're looking at technology, AI, as a source of growth and innovation. But hearkening back to work that I did earlier with the United Nations on gender equality, one way that we could see more growth is to reduce barriers to entry for women in the workforce. And that maybe takes us back to the US point that sometimes the mechanisms for bringing about more growth, better standards of living can often be just policymakers getting barriers out of the way.
Thanks very much, Tina. That was Tina Fordham, founder of Fordham Global Foresight. And now here's Anita Riota with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. French President Emmanuel Macron has called for a ban on arms deliveries to Israel, arguing the priority should be to find a political solution. Macron has criticized Tel Aviv's decision to send ground troops into Lebanon. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu slammed the comments, telling the French leader, "Shame on you." BP has reportedly abandoned its target to reduce oil and gas output by 2030. The energy giant is looking to scale back its green strategy to restore investor confidence, according to a Reuters report, instead making several new investments to boost oil and gas output. Nobel Prize Week is underway. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine has been awarded to two scientists for their discovery of a new class of RNA molecules that play a crucial role in gene regulation. Awards for literature, peace, and economics will be announced over the course of the week. I'm Anita Riota with our headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Anita. Today marks 1 year since Hamas's brutal attack on southern Israel that set off a devastating retaliatory response from Israel in Gaza and has now sparked a wider war in the Middle East. Monocle's foreign desk has dedicated an entire show to the anniversary, and as part of that, Andrew Muller spoke with Mina Al-Oraibi, editor-in-chief of The National in Abu Dhabi. He began by asking how the day landed in her newsroom as everyone began to understand just what had happened on October 7th.
Of course, it happened over a weekend, and so many newsrooms were half-staffed, and very quickly we realized, no, this is going to be a major moment. And we knew, of course, there'd be major repercussions also, not only in Gaza, but on the region. So again, like every newsroom in the region, we immediately started flooding back to the newsroom and trying to understand what exactly happened. And one of the surprises was how extensive the attacks were and for how long the Hamas attack continued in Israel before measures were taken to stop it. And so as it started to unfold, what was clear was that this was an attack that was coordinated for quite some time. But the assumption amongst many was that Iran or Hezbollah would come in also, that there would be a wider attack on Israel because surely...
This was the beginning of something coordinated.
Yeah, there was an idea that it would be coordinated because surely for Hamas to take on such a bold attack, the response from the Israelis and the Israeli military was always going to be extreme. And so the idea was this the beginning of this wider regional war that Iran had often threatened with different proxies. And it seemed in the first few days that was not going to happen, that instead this was Hamas had been able to keep this under wraps because very few people even knew it was going to happen outside of Gaza. And perhaps that was the reason they were able to pull it off. So there were many, many questions being asked in those first hours, but there was a collective acknowledgement that this was a major moment.
Because that all touches on one, or what strikes me at least, as one of the great unanswered questions, and it is a question I have put to a lot of people and have not yet had a concise answer, really, which is, why did Hamas do this? Because, as you've correctly said, there was only ever going to be one level of Israeli response, as there always is, and it was obviously going to be of an order of magnitude even more severe than usual, given the scale of this attack. So Hamas presumably had some idea of what they thought this was going to accomplish other than what it has accomplished. Has it ever been clear to you what that is?
It's hard to understand how they thought the response would be anything but that. And the fact that they hadn't prepared their own people. You know, you have Gazans who have said, you know, there are no shelters, there are no tunnels. There wasn't even a stock of extra food or medicines or anything to try to get through an oncoming war. It's hard to understand what they thought would happen in the long term, but it isn't hard to understand why they did it, in the sense that it seemed that Israel and Saudi Arabia were moving towards a possible deal. And that, in the minds not only of Hamas, but in the minds of many Palestinians, would have meant really the end of a pursuit of an independent Palestinian state. Saudi diplomats and officials insist that they would not have come to an agreement or a deal with Israel unless there was a clear path forward for a two-state solution. But they didn't say that they would make sure that there was a Palestinian state before signing a deal with Israel.
Is it also possible that Hamas surmised that that two-state solution that might have been part of a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia would have very little room in it for Hamas, whom, of course, the Saudis are not big fans?
Yes. And it's clear that Hamas were increasingly isolated from most Arab capitals. They were getting closer to Iran, who became their biggest backer. Of course, a major moment for Hamas was when the uprising in Syria happened and Hamas decided to take a position against the Syrians, moved both to Qatar and Turkey. And so there were different iterations of Hamas, let's say, but what was clear was that Hamas had become very close to Iran and was of a belief that they had to fight their way against Israel, that there wasn't going to be a peace accord that would have room for them, or frankly, that the current Israeli administration or the political factions in Israel appeared serious in terms of having a proper Palestinian state. Having said that, Hamas themselves, to this day, are at different ends of the spectrum from the Palestinian Authority and Fatah, which runs the West Bank. So you're right to question whether a deal between the Saudis and Israelis, even if it led to a Palestinian state, would have room for Hamas. And that is true. It's hard to know also what opportunity Hamas felt they had on that particular date, the 7th of October, 2023, where they felt they could actually carry out militarily that attack, that perhaps they wouldn't have that window in other times. And I think that's also something to take into account. That's they may have had these plans, and it was just when was the moment that they could actually strike, and they felt that that was the opportunity. So while the bigger geopolitical play may have been a greater motivator, Hamas has always wanted to put as much pressure or damage on Israel as possible, and it was that moment that they were able to carry out the attack. I think it was also very important for Hamas to be able to take away the idea that the Israeli Iron Dome, that the Israeli military, the Israeli intelligence was invincible. And they showed a weakness and a vulnerability in Israel that not only has affected, of course, the psyche of the Israeli population, but actually regionally, questions started to be asked about how strong really was this military intelligence that the Israelis had, and that up until that point had been able to deflect Hamas, Hezbollah, and others.
Mina Al-Oraibi there of The National, speaking with Andrew Muller. Check out the full Foreign Desk episode on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak, and it is Nobel Prize Week, coming against the backdrop of all the wars and conflicts we've just been speaking about, which makes awarding the Nobel Peace Prize an especially complicated endeavor this year. Before that, the week does, of course, highlight some of the more positive news out of lots of disciplines, from literature to the sciences. And for a roundup of the Nobel Prizes and other Nordic news, I'm joined right here in the studio by Tonje Iversen, UK correspondent for Norwegian broadcasters TV2 and P4. Good afternoon, Tonje.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
This is not the first time that the Nobel Prize is being awarded under a cloud of conflict. So I did want to start there with you, Tonje. This year does feel somewhat different, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, it's been an awful year. Wars, a refugee crisis, famine, and suffering all over the world. And there are those who believe that because of this, it might send a very powerful signal if the Peace Prize were withheld this year. And withholding the Peace Prize is not new. It has been suspended 19 times before, including during the World Wars. But there are also those who say that especially because of this year, that it's been so difficult, that there's been so many conflicts around the world, the Nobel Peace Prize is more important than ever. So that it should be awarded. And there are lots of nominees, of course, as every year, and there's always like a lot of excitement attached to who will actually get the Nobel Peace Prize. We have heard from academics at the Free University in Amsterdam that they have nominated organizations like Eco Peace, Women Wage Peace, and Women of the Sun for peace, promoting peace in between Israelis and Palestinians.
It is a really interesting debate, isn't it? Exactly the way that you lay that out there, that on the one hand, you almost want to punish the world for not being able to secure peace, frankly, anywhere at this point. But at the same time, there are so many people that are working on peace, and you highlighted a few there. I mean, how has this discussion been going in Oslo? What has the organization itself said about this? Do we have any indications which way they're going to go?
Oh, we never really do. It's such an intense
Always
secrecy.
secretive, isn't it?
Yes. So we really don't know. We know again this year David Attenborough is also nominated. So there's also this, very famous people who are nominated almost every year, and we really don't know. Sometimes it's a huge surprise.
What is it like, can I ask, for a journalist in Oslo? I mean, how does this work when you're kind of reading the tea leaves of all of this? I mean, how furiously are journalists trying to get any kind of indication of what's coming?
Well, I know a lot of journalists get very proud if they are able to get close, or maybe even have said the name of the person or the organizations that are having the prize awarded. But as always, it's so difficult to predict.
And before we get to the Peace Prize, of course, there are a bunch of other awards that are coming out. We have also had the first one today from medicine. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that, or some of the others as well that are coming up in the next few days.
Oh, yes. So there are several prizes being awarded this week. I think the one for economy is 14th of October. But we know that a lot of people are holding their breath thinking about that. Some of these prizes probably will be connected to artificial intelligence. AI is a massive thing. So a lot of people would assume that artificial intelligence would be something that would be recognized this year, but we don't know.
We don't know what's going to happen, but we will be covering it throughout this week, I'm sure, also here on Monocle Radio. But speaking of this kind of backdrop of global conflicts that we were discussing, you do have other news as well from Norway, which is the latest country that is planning to build a border with Russia.
Yeah, so Norway is considering building a fence along the 123-mile border it shares with Russia. And this is a move inspired by a similar project in Finland in order to prevent Moscow from using migrants in what the Finnish government calls Russia's hybrid warfare. So the Nordic country is now building fences along the border zone. The Norwegian government have described a border fence as a very interesting idea, not only because it can act as a deterrent, but because it contains sensors and technologies that would allow the government to see if people were moving around this area or close to the border. So this is something that the Norwegian government now are looking into.
It is something interesting in itself. I think some people might not realize necessarily that Norway even has a border with Russia. How conscious are people in Norway of this? How much of a discussion has this been within Norway?
Yeah, so of course the Norwegian border to Russia is much, much smaller than the Finnish one. But it's been a tradition in the north between northern Norway and Russia to cooperate, universities cooperate. There has been a travel zone there where people have tried to make it more easy easy to travel between Russia and Norway. Of course, that has been heavily scaled down since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But I think especially for people living in north of Norway, it has been a huge shift. Because there's been so much cooperation there, and there's also a lot of Russian people living in the north of Norway.
And are those people, I mean, how has that relationship gone between the two from what you understand? I assume that entire, aside from the border itself, that entire relationship has changed somewhat.
Yes, it has. The cooperation has been heavily scaled down, but also there's a lot of hurt in that area because people have neighbors who are Russians or Russians who feel hurt because of the lack of cooperation and how they see like the big shift that has happened.
Well, we wanted to touch on one other story before we let you go, Tonya, because this is really interesting news out of Sweden, one of the countries that has always been very strong on pioneering paid parental leave. They're going to expand this now. Basically, you can kind of give your parental leave to grandparents, friends, relatives, whoever you like.
Yes, and many think this is a wonderful idea that parents in Sweden can now transfer paid paternal leave days to people who are not a legal guardian. So that could include grandparents, it could be relatives, it could even be friends. So Sweden has, like you say, always been a pioneer when it comes to parental leave. It was the first country to introduce paid paternal leave to fathers in 1974. And according to the Swedish Social Insurance Agency, today fathers take around 30% of the paid parental leave. And now then, 50 years later in Sweden, you can have the grandparents being paid for looking after the children. And this is is in order to make it more flexible for different types of families, and also to give people a choice that they don't have to choose between career and family, that they can combine and mix and match and as they please, basically making it more flexible and easy.
And so if I understand, perhaps you could lay this out, I don't know how many months one gets in Sweden, but I guess this is similar to Germany that I understood when I was there as well, that you could divide the time between the mother and father in terms of who gets as much. Everyone could take a minimum, I think it was, and then, you could get a minimum, and then the remaining time you could split how you see fit. So this is kind of like you get a bunch of months and then you can split it among however many people you want.
Yes, absolutely. And these rules, they allow parents to transfer up to 45 paid days to someone else. And if they're a single parent, it's 90 days. And that is from the total of 480 days of paid parental leaves. So I think there's a lot of people who might be eager to try out these new rules.
And there's going to be a lot of people around the world hearing 480 days and being quite jealous. Tonya Iversen, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. MyTheresa has acquired Yoox Net-a-Porter from Swiss giant Richemont. MyTheresa's CEO Michael Klieger said the deal elevates the e-commerce platform to being a preeminent luxury group with a potential gross merchandise value of €4 billion. Monocle's fashion director Natalie Theodosi spoke with interim CEO and president of Yoox Net-a-Porter, Alison Loehnis, about the company's goals moving forward. Natalie began by asking Alison what she's looking forward to.
Really continuing to focus, I know I keep using that word, to focus on what we do best. I think service, curation. When I describe our businesses, I say that we've done the heavy lifting for you. We've gone out, we've looked at every brand, we've been in every showroom, we've done everything, and we have selected the things that we deem to be really the most relevant for our customer and the best that's out there. So you don't have to do that. Really focusing on this curation, using content to bring it life, continuing to do what we do, to serve our EIPs, to do what we do, but do it even better. And by better, it's from a localization standpoint, making sure that we're speaking to you in your language, literally and figuratively, using delivery methods that are most relevant to you, payment methods, etc. Personalization, again, it's a hot topic, I think, but really making sure that we are showing you the things that are most relevant to you. And it's in no way shortchanging your experience, but making sure you can find the things you want to the fastest. We can help you discover things in the quickest way possible. I think, continuing for us as a business to continue to give back to the communities that we serve is really incredibly important. And by that, I'm not talking about, localization or serving the customer, but also saying, okay, if New York is a very big market for us, what are we doing from a charitable perspective to help really give back to that market?
And more from, again, a more macro industry perspective, there have been all these conversations. You mentioned kind of the boom of D2C. When you were starting at Net-a-Porter, we've seen e-commerce first, a lot of doubters, then a big boom. Now we're also talking about the return to stores. How do you see it? Now, I mean, it's second nature for us to shop online at this point, but how do you see it evolving and also standing side to side to the physical shopping and to the more traditional stores?
I think they'll continue to coexist beautifully. I think I've yet to meet any shopper who only will shop. I mean, even when people say I only shop online, they're buying things in stores as well. They may not be buying the same things in stores that they're buying online. And ditto, I don't think I've come across anyone who's never bought anything online. Although I'd be curious too, because I would like to understand more about that. And so I think that they will continue to exist. I just think you need to, as a business, and I think coming back to your point around what is the state of play now, you need to have a reason for being. Why are people going to come to you? What do you do that's different? And how are you going to make me as a customer, how are you going to make my life? What are you doing for me that something else isn't doing for me? But it doesn't mean, I think I couldn't agree with you more on the sort of perhaps the disruptive nature of sensationalist headlines, because people will shop in stores and that's wonderful. But again, as a store, why am I going to the store? What's my value add there? And customers will shop online. And perhaps there'll be fewer players, and we're seeing quite a lot of consolidation in the market, but the two will continue to exist side by side.
That was Monocle's Natalie Theodosi in conversation with interim CEO and president of Yoox Net-a-Porter, Alison Loehnis. You can listen to the full conversation on The Big Interview. Head over to our website or wherever you get your podcasts. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Anita Riotta. Our researcher was Gunnar Grunlid, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.